To get to boundaries, I think it's important to go through, to start with values, okay? What are my personal values and what are my values in a relationship? Our needs and our attachment style and connection style, so basically the way we grew up and over our lifetime, what became our values, are gonna impact and inform what the needs are. Then we can basically start figuring out what the boundaries are. So if you don't have a clear set of values, it's going to be hard to then express your needs. What those values are really depend on how secure you feel, how safe you feel, and really what you've done in your life to be kind of self-sufficient in meeting those needs, and what you need from others to help you meet those needs. So I've written down a few universal values that a lot of people, tend to want, but it's very personal to each one. And in the groups, we're going to go a little bit more into figuring out what our values are. I don't know if you've heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow developed this theory of need hierarchy, which I found out recently was actually influenced by a hierarchy of needs from the Blackfoot Native American tribe. It's slightly different there, and I've spent a little bit about more of this, but I'm happy to share further resources if you're interested more. The basic idea of hierarchy of needs is that if you're not having your physiological basic needs met, it's very hard to aspire for other needs. If you don't have air, food, water, sleep, kind of basic needs, it's going to be really hard to think about security, about friendship, about wanting achievement and respect, etc. But it's not exactly a pyramid, and I think a lot of people that know about this have seen it as a pyramid. Maslow didn't design it as a pyramid. So think about it more as a ladder, where you have your legs and your feet and your hands in different rungs of the ladder. And it's important to have needs at different rungs basically met. It's not just about climbing from one to the other. And it's also possible that even without stability, you're still going to be able to aspire for self-actualization, for example. Coming to terms with where I am on this kind of hierarchy and where I feel that my needs are met will help me figure out what do I actually want from the relationship, and where my partner can maybe help me meet some of those needs. I want to use a metaphor to explain a little bit more about how the boundaries come into play. So imagine that yourself, who you are is the house. Around the house, there's a garden, which is all your needs. It can be basic needs for survival, for emotional, mental health. All of those needs are in this garden, okay? And beyond the garden, there's a field, which is your wants. It's basically what you're aspiring to, and it can be about further comfort, happiness, general well-being. All of those things are going to be in the kind of wider field. And oftentimes, we create a boundary around that field. And for that reason, people find it quite hard to say, take risks, because they're comfortable where they are and they're not willing to risk anything happening to that field of wants, right? Now, without risk, obviously, there isn't any reward and there isn't an opportunity of expanding that field as well, because the boundary is limiting in both directions. But around the needs, there is a hard boundary. When that when that boundary is compromised, it basically triggers a fight or flight response. It threatens your survival, your mental health, your emotional security, and losing that sense of security feels like a mortal danger. The work in creating clear boundaries is figuring out what are my hard boundaries, so I can start letting go of the soft boundaries, which basically means that I can let people in and I can expand my presence, my awareness. I like this comic from Tikva Wolf, from Kimchi Cuddles, which also helps to explain the difference between a rule, an agreement, and a boundary, right? And put it very simply, with a rule, and that goes back to my personal story, is I'm going to limit and decide what your behavior is, so my needs are met and my boundaries are safeguarded. And I will hold you responsible for protecting my boundaries and meeting my needs. Okay. And that's especially in non-monogamy. I mean, I think it's always not the right way to do it, even monogamy, but especially non-monogamy, that's really hard to uphold. I would say almost impossible, and for both people and people in the relationship to be happy. With an agreement, we can find a path that will safeguard both our needs and recognize that we are each responsible for our own boundaries within that agreement, but we find a way to collaborate. Compromise sometimes, but then collaborate. The boundaries that we create for ourselves are in different categories, and they apply to your physical world. And it can be about, how do you like to be touched? How do you like to be greeted? How much personal physical space do you need when having a conversation, sharing a bed? Are you comfortable with someone touching you when you sleep or not touching when you sleep? Do you need space for yourself in a shared house? All of those physical boundaries. Social boundaries are more about what you can what you want to share with other people, how comfortable you are with the people speaking and sharing about your life. How much time do you need alone time, and how much do you want to be involved in other people's social lives? Right. Emotional boundaries are around the emotional support that you need. So do you know when to reach out and ask for emotional support? Are you able to also be there for someone else that requests emotional support from you if you are emotionally feeling compromised? Do you have any requirements for how much your partner should be able to process and manage their own emotional issues, for example, when you don't have the spoons for it? Sexual boundaries are around sexual contact, sexual activities or kinks or fetishes that for you are hard or soft limits. Activities that you really need to experience to feel satisfied. Knowing as much as you can about your own body and how you react in sexual situations means that you can communicate that with a partner and not leave things just to chance or for things to kind of happen naturally because they may or may not happen. Cognitive boundaries are around topics and different areas that you're comfortable discussing or not comfortable talking about. Maybe certain beliefs or world views that you feel very passionate about or that you're not compatible with other people. That can also be around ethics because they're very personal and subjective. And then finally, material boundaries are around the finances, money issues, possessions. How do you feel in your attachment style if, around giving and receiving gifts? Do you want to have a joint bank account or keep expenses separately? All of that goes into material boundaries. I will stop here and pass it on to Claire. Then there'll be a few more slides that I will use for the exercises in the room.
So my name, like I said, my name is Claire, and I will tell my own personal story as well. So I didn't mention my relationship status before, but I have been with my nesting partner for almost 10 years, which is really exciting. I'm thinking about like, what do we do for our anniversary next year? We have been living together for about 7 or 8 years, and we've been in a V or a W. Like there's multiple partners now involved, where my partner has another serious partner and dates a couple other people, and then I have another partner of 2 years, where it's actually our anniversary this weekend as well. So maybe a W or a never-ending V, where there's just multiple, links and hinges of partners involved. And so my boundary story is that a few years ago, we were living together in the same house. I was living in a house with my partner and his other partner. And I was realizing, I was starting to get in touch with some of like my family dynamics and how I didn't want to reflect them necessarily in the polyam structure that I was in. So that kind of like wanting to work through past pain from childhood and also build healthy relationships in the present. So it just happened to be the case that at this time, maybe around 6 years ago, so it was the first kind of like first year of my partner's relationship with his newer partner. Or maybe the first 2 years, yeah, because she didn't move in right away. But they were having more conflict than they had had before. And I realized that I kept putting myself in a position where I would not try to mediate the conflict, but be playing this role where I would minimize myself, knowing that they were having issues. So I kind of say, oh, don't worry about me, or don't worry about this plan that we had. I know you guys need to work things out. It wasn't really as though anyone else was crossing my boundaries in the sense of, really messing with my schedule or messing with my day-to-day life in some obvious way. But it took a friend visiting and really just being able to vent and talk about it to realize that I actually really wanted to set a boundary that I not hear much or very much about their conflict anymore. So they're in a much better place now. And it's very much the case now that I don't hear much about their conflicts either. And so that feels now like a much easier boundary. But at the time, it felt like such a big deal to say, oh, can you please actually not have this kind of like kitchen table talk about what's going on in our different relationships? Even though I would say, if you're familiar with the term kitchen table polyamory, where, everybody's friends and kind of spends time together, we had that dynamic and we still do. But it was just important to realize there were boundaries that I wanted to set in that context as well. And that's totally fine. It's not like, oh, if you are close to all your different partners in metamorphosis, you all have to be in the same space, just having no sense of boundary or separation at all. So that's my story. And it also relates to what I want to talk about today. So I have been thinking a lot ever since Roy invited me to do this work. Let me screen share. I'm thinking about this concept of smooth and spiky boundaries. First of all, I don't actually think there are just two types of boundaries, but this is like a framework, conceptual framework for thinking about it in a way that I think is very useful. So smooth and spiky boundaries. So I would describe a smooth boundary as something that feels easy, obvious, and even calm, just something that you have no problem upholding, comes with minimal mental drama. So for me, mental drama is when I'm kind of like, oh, I don't know about this. Maybe I should do it this way. Is it really okay for me to ask this? Maybe I should be doing this. Lots of shoulds and lots of back and forth. For me, a smooth boundary is something that doesn't really have that and is just really easy to uphold. So maybe obvious is also a really key word here. So an example in a relationship might be, well, if my partner accidentally touches a really sore muscle because I went running earlier this week and they have no idea that my whatever that muscle is that always is hurt when you're a runner, the IT band, my partner actually accidentally touched the sore muscle, then I will ask them to please stop touching there. And that feels pretty obvious to me. And it's not like, oh, I shouldn't tell them not to do that because it hurts. It also may be easier to identify smooth boundaries in relationships that are not your most intimate ones. So, for example, if a stranger walks too close to me on the street, I'll start walking faster. And I might be annoyed about that for a second. I might be like, oh my God, get away from me. But at the same time, it's not necessarily something I'm going to be thinking about hours later. And there's just this real sense of this is obvious, right? This is a smooth boundary. And so the second concept is what I call spiky boundaries. And under examples here, I have a question mark because I think that it 100% depends on you and your different needs and your background as to what would constitute a spikier boundary. So a spiky boundary is one that does bring up a lot of mental drama, a lot of feelings of anger, defensiveness, even shame. And I think that spiky boundaries typically indicate there's some kind of emotional trigger. There's something where there's a sensitivity that's being pressed on. And so it makes it harder to sort of like see the forest for the trees when you're thinking through these kind of boundaries. Spiky boundaries are also, the issue with them really would be, aside from like the negative emotionality around them, is that they could actually be harder to uphold and maybe broken more easily. So just going back to my personal story with my partner and his partner, I think that that definitely used to be a spikier boundary for me when I was starting to realize that I didn't want to hear as much about the conflict that they've been having. And so if my partner did bring it up, I'd kind of be like, excuse me, I thought we had just talked about this. I thought we had this boundary now. And I think that part of what was going on for me, at least, and you'll have to analyze, and we'll talk about it in the breakout sessions as well. You'll have to analyze for yourself. For me, it was that I was still learning that it was okay for me to have that boundary. And I was still actually pretty heavily doubting, I think deep down, whether it was okay for me to really ask for that. And so I think that the kind of spikier boundaries where there's anger and defensiveness, that may be where those boundaries come from. So the key point is that, first of all, this isn't to create a big problem around spiky boundaries. I think that they're actually not a problem at all. It's very normal to have negative feelings come up sometimes and to react in ways that, we don't, that take up a lot of space for us, but that we're still, you may be glad that you set the boundary. If you're just learning how to set important boundaries in your relationships, most of them might be spiky and it could stay that way for a while. And the reason why is that if you learn growing up, for example, that boundaries aren't really possible, then spiky boundaries might be what you're able to do. And so I don't think that we should really problematize this, but I do want to suggest that smooth boundaries, when we can just be calm and feel as though our boundaries, it's obvious that they should exist and it's okay to have them. Typically, I think this creates much better results for us. So, it's great to have less of that mental drama, better relationships, more energy for what we really care about. And the reason why I would say this is that, yeah, so why exactly? Like, what's the crux of why a smoother boundary might lead to better results for us? I think it's because we are able to see the situation or the behavior that's bothering us in a more neutral, kind of calm way. I don't want to say detached because I don't really like that word. I don't find it very helpful. I'm really interested in interdependence, not being completely detached. But there's something about the stranger bumps up on you on the street. You don't like that behavior, but you're able to easily kind of de-identify from and say, no, thank you. I'm not interested in that. There's not much drama to it. Yeah, and so for me, like I said, this example of asking my partner not to talk about conflict with his other partner now for me would be a smooth boundary. And I think that that's because of time, first of all, but also just getting comfortable with the idea of it being a totally fine boundary to have, and a completely acceptable way to think, and conduct myself. So the big question is, if you are interested in moving from spiky to smooth boundaries, if you have a spikier boundary now that you would like to get to that smoother place, I think there are a few ways that we can do that. I have one more. Yeah. So here's a kind of really big picture of what I think it takes to get to that place with any given boundary. And when we're doing breakout rooms, we'll think if there are situations in the past where you've gotten from a spikier to a smoother place. Part one is to feel all the feelings. When we say this, when we say process your feelings, for me, it doesn't necessarily mean spend days and days having difficult feelings. You're absolutely welcome to do that. But what I mean when I say feel your feelings, feel the feelings that you're having around that boundary, I mean to identify the physical sensations in your body and to note them and to allow them to be there and to notice the storyline in your head that's passing through. So what you're really trying to do is get a little bit of distance from that storyline, from that narrative, and to feel in your body. And that gives your feelings all the space that they need to be there. The second one, learn to love the behavior that's bothering you. And if you don't like the term love, that's totally fine. At the very least, get to feeling neutral about what it is that you're asking for a boundary around. And this can feel like a little complicated because it's not like, oh, you want to make excuses for people. You want to say it's okay that somebody acted in a way that we didn't like. But it's this very paradoxical outcome that I have learned from coaching on such a deep level that, for example, if a parent, for example, if my dad calls, this isn't actually in my life, but if my dad calls and yells at me on the phone, or if one of my parents crosses a boundary that, in a way that I really dislike, what I'm going to be trying to do is learn to really understand why they might do that and to generate compassion for it, like from a deep place in myself. And it might seem like, yeah, you're just giving someone an excuse or something like that. But I have found so paradoxically that that actually gives me loving and the healing energy that I need to really move to a place where the boundary is easier, where I am feeling so, so much love for myself a little bit of love for the other person, so much self-love that I'm able to then set or reinforce that boundary from a place of love. Yeah. So these are the three key steps. So to feel feelings, all the feelings associated with the spiky boundary, learn to love or at least get to neutral about the behavior that's really bothering you. And from that place of love, centered around self-love and love for the other person, that's where you get to set or reinforce the boundary from that place. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to exploring this more in our breakout groups, and I will pause there.